This is what won the lunch vote? Well, I didn't vote. I just assumed pizza would win. Dear Nat and Moby, we always hear how voting is super important, but why? And how does it work? Thanks, Kayla and Sadie. Voting is a way for groups of people to make decisions fairly. Everyone gets to pick the option they want, and the choice that gets the most votes wins. You've probably voted for something before. Maybe a team captain, or what movie to see with your friends. But when you hear about voting in the news, it's usually about our government. The United States is a democracy. It comes from an ancient Greek word meaning people power. In democracies, citizens have a say in how their country is run. Yeah, that might seem like a given now. But in 1776, when America was established, it was a radical setup. Most other nations were ruled by kings or queens. No major state had tried democracy for close to 2,000 years. One of the world's first democracies was ancient Athens. Citizens would gather at a special place to debate the major issues facing the city, like whether to collect a new tax or make peace with some neighboring city. And when it came time to make a decision, they'd all get to vote. This is called a direct democracy because citizens vote directly on laws. Of course, back then, only free males could qualify to be a citizen. No women and no slaves allowed. A bit later on, the Romans came along. They were big admirers of Greek culture and democracy. But Rome had conquered a lot of different places, including Greece. There were millions of citizens and thousands of decisions to make every year. It wasn't exactly convenient for everyone to gather around and debate every issue. So instead of a direct democracy, Rome set up a republic. Citizens would vote on senators to represent them in government, and those guys would vote on specific laws. But just like Greece, Roman citizenship was confined to free men only. Well, the Roman Republic didn't really work out. The Senate kept getting weaker, while the emperor grew more powerful, until it was a republic in name only. For a couple thousand years after that, everyone figured, maybe this democracy thing isn't such a swell idea. Until the late 1700s. That's when some hotheads, led by George Washington, decided to give it another go. America was already pretty big, so they went for Rome's republic model. Citizens would vote on politicians to represent them in government. And because old habits die hard, this was kind of a white men only situation. It took nearly 200 years for every adult American to win the right to vote. Women got it in 1920, and it wasn't until the 1960s that African Americans could safely vote in every state. As the makeup of the voting public changed, so did our representatives. They began to look just a little bit more like the rest of the country, and to pass legislation that would benefit a broader range of Americans. That's why voting isn't just a right for American citizens, it's a responsibility. Representatives should, represent all of the people, because their decisions affect everyone. They set our taxes, control our natural resources, and say what's legal and what isn't. They choose whether the country goes to war and who fights it. Citizens make one big decision, picking the people who make those choices. Any American citizen 18 or older can participate, which means there are almost 250 million eligible voters. But even in a good year, only about half of them turn out to vote. Yeah, voter turnout is highest for presidential elections every 4 years. That makes sense because presidents wield a huge amount of power. They enforce laws, direct foreign policy, and serve as commander-in-chief of our military. Presidents really set the tone and agenda for the entire government. But national elections actually take place every 2 years. Citizens vote on the representatives and senators who make up Congress. Congress writes our nation's laws, which can support or block stuff the president wants to do. That means voting in congressional races is super important. State and local elections have a huge impact on people's lives too. Those officials decide on stuff like schools, construction, and transportation. Yep, simply voting isn't enough. You need to know what you're voting for. Democracy only works when voters educate themselves about the issues. You need to consider how the candidates, the people running for office, would vote on those issues. Their political party can give you some idea of that. Each party stands for a set of core beliefs about how to run the government. Candidates will explain where they personally stand in speeches and on their websites. Most elections happen on Election Day. It falls on the first Tuesday in November, as long as it's not November 1st. Most voters head to their polling places to cast their votes. Some sites have electronic voting. Voters touch a screen or push a button. At other places, they might fill out cards that get fed into a scanner. And a few still issue paper ballots that get counted by hand. Plus, in more than half the states, people can vote early by mail. But whichever method they use to vote, voters have the right to privacy. No one is supposed to see who anyone else is voting for. That way, everyone can vote for what they believe, even if it's super weird. I really shouldn't. I'm trying to cut down. Good morning, Mr. Clark. My name's Nat, and I'm with Vote Taxi. The sun's out, it's election day, and we're here to drive you to the polls. Safely. And in style. Lost another one. I knew we should have gone for the beige cargo van. Dear Nat and Moby, how come there's a Voting Rights Act? Isn't the right to vote in the Constitution? From Lucretia. Great question, Lucretia. When the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, the right to vote was in the Constitution. In fact, it was in several places. The 14th Amendment guaranteed it to white male citizens over 21. The 15th protected voting for men of other races. The 19th covered women's suffrage. So, according to the law of the land in 1965, all adult citizens had had the right to vote for decades. But passing a law, even a constitutional amendment, doesn't guarantee it will be followed. Across the South, Black people faced intimidation and violence just for trying to cast a ballot. They were beaten, tear-gassed, and even killed, sometimes by police. Well, let's take it back a bit, like to the beginning of the United States. When the Constitution was first written, it didn't include anything about who could vote. It left that decision up to the individual states, and they each came up with their own rules. In Vermont, voters had to be of a quiet and peaceable behavior. While in South Carolina, voters had to believe in God, heaven, and hell. In New Jersey, some women and African Americans could vote, at least at first. But overall, across the country, it was mostly white men with property who got to vote. Lawmakers wanted voters to be careful, thoughtful, and invested in the success of the republic. And the only people they could imagine having those qualities were, well, people just like them. Which meant that in America's first national elections, only about 6% of the population could vote. By 1830, most states at least dropped the property requirements. Voting was no longer about what you owned, it was about who you were. And who you had to be was white and male. Which is how it stayed for decades until after the Civil War. Suddenly, millions of formerly enslaved people were free, and lawmakers had to decide what rights this group would have. The Reconstruction Amendments guaranteed them full equal citizenship, which included the right to vote, at least for men. For the first time, the Constitution said voting is a right that states can't take away. African Americans started voting and getting elected to office, from mayor all the way up to Congress. They began remaking the South, taking huge strides towards racial equality, which didn't sit so well with a lot of white people there. They liked being in power and didn't want that to change. Southern states began a century-long campaign of voter suppression, sneaky tactics to stop certain voters from casting their ballots. The Reconstruction Amendments said you can't ban someone from voting based on race, but it didn't say anything about making them pay a poll tax, a fee for voting, or take a literacy test, which were designed to be nearly impossible to pass. Technically, these regulations obeyed the letter of constitutional law, but in reality, they were designed to block black voters. The result was all-white state governments passing racist laws. They segregated public spaces, keeping African Americans separate from whites. Changing that took 100 years and a long, hard fight. It came to a head with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, when many African Americans risked their lives to vote. Like the activist Fannie Lou Hamer, who survived several assassination attempts and being beaten by police in Mississippi. And John Lewis, one of many attacked by a police-led mob in Selma, Alabama. Lewis, who went on to become a congressman, was leading a march for voting rights. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., killed for his role as a leader of the movement, but not before seeing the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed. It closed the loopholes that had denied so many people their constitutional rights. Along with the 24th Amendment, it outlawed poll taxes and literacy tests, and protected other groups who had been excluded from our democracy, like Native Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos. Voter rolls skyrocketed, and the government took a big step towards truly representing the people. It was a huge victory and a proud moment for this country. But like we've seen, the fight for progress can feel like a game of whack-a-mole. Outlaw one abusive practice, and a new one pops up. State and local officials are still in charge of how elections are run, and they can pull all kinds of sneaky tricks to discourage certain people from voting. Like reducing the number of polling locations so voters have to wait in line for hours, or requiring a special ID that's difficult for poor people to get, or redrawing district lines to favor one political party over the other. On paper, these new voter suppression tactics have nothing to do with race. But in practice, they disproportionately affect people of color. And recently, it's gotten much easier to do this stuff. The Voting Rights Act used to require that certain states get approval before passing new election laws. But in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down that part of the act, opening up a whole new set of loopholes. Within a few years, 25 states had passed hundreds of new voting regulations, a lot of which are designed to lower turnout, the total number of voters. Hey now, don't get mad, get motivated. Most Americans support all kinds of ideas that would make voting easier, like turning Election Day into a national holiday and letting everyone vote by mail. So the more people we get to the polls today, the more likely we are to get leaders who will strengthen voting rights. Now, Where are we headed next? To find America? Groovy. Welcome to Brain Pop News. We're counting down to November 3rd, Election Day 2020, and urging every grown-up and their mom to vote. I know I'm on the edge of my seat to find out who will be elected president. The incumbent or current office holder, President Donald Trump, or the challenger, Joe Biden, who served as vice president under Barack Obama. Plus, there are a slew of senators, representatives, governors, and others up for election around the country. So bring it on, Election Night 2020. Okay, make that election month 2020. COVID-19 has slowed everything down this year. But some stuff is still the same, like how you win. For a quick review of that, let's turn to our senior map guy, Tim.
Thanks, Nat. Most U.S. elections follow a
Welcome to Brain Pop News. We're counting down to November 3rd, Election Day 2020, and urging every grown-up and their mom to vote. I know I'm on the edge of my seat to find out who will be elected president. The incumbent or current office holder, President Donald Trump, or the challenger, Joe Biden, who served as vice president under Barack Obama. Plus, there are a slew of senators, representatives, governors, and others up for election around the country. So bring it on, Election Night 2020. Okay, make that election month 2020. COVID-19 has slowed everything down this year. But some stuff is still the same, like how you win. For a quick review of that, let's turn to our senior map guy, Tim.
Thanks, Nat. Most U.S. elections follow a pretty simple rule. Whoever gets the most votes wins. But presidential elections are not so straightforward. You can think of it like an elaborate game with a complicated scoring system. Instead of competing for individual votes, candidates are trying to win these electoral votes. That's a number assigned to each state based on its population. The more people who live in a state, the more electoral votes it gets. There are 538 in total. The candidate who can get a majority of those, 270 or more, wins the election. So, on Election Day, each state begins to count up its residents' votes. And in every state but Maine and Nebraska, whoever gets the majority wins all of that state's electoral votes. That process repeats for every state in the Union, with each candidate adding all their votes to their total. This system is known as the Electoral College. Biden is a Democrat, so he can likely count on winning these solid blue states. And Trump, a Republican, can count on these solid red states. Swing states are the real battlegrounds of a presidential election. They swing between the Democratic and Republican candidates from election to election. So their electoral votes tend to swing elections one way or the other. This election, the states in hottest contention include Ohio, North Carolina, Florida, Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. Their electoral votes are most likely to swing the election. You can learn way more about the path to the presidency in our presidential election topic. But Nat can tell you more about election night.
Thanks, Tim. On Election Day, voting sites close in the evening. times vary state to state. Then, news outlets start reporting on results. You might hear that a candidate is leading in a certain state based on, say, 60% of precincts reporting. That means for every 10 voting districts there, 6 have reported a winner. More data comes from exit polls, interviews with voters about who they voted for. Eventually, there's enough data to predict a winner in the state, though occasionally, the projections get corrected as more info comes in. By late at night, we usually know who's won the presidency. Even though all the votes still haven't been counted, ballots that are mailed in might not get tallied until weeks later. But there are usually so few of these that they don't change the outcome. Right, this year is far from usual. Because of the pandemic, lots of people aren't voting in person. They're voting by mail. Mail-in ballots could make up half or more of the votes, which is likely to make tallying the results a little slow. Depending on how close the race is, because of the pandemic, even though all the votes still haven't been counted, ballots that are mailed in might not get tallied until weeks later. But there are usually so few of these that they don't change the outcome. Right, this year is far from usual. Because of the pandemic, lots of people aren't voting in person. They're voting by mail. Mail-in ballots could make up half or more of the votes, which is likely to make tallying the results a little slow. Depending on how close the race is, it may take a long time to determine the winner, like days or even weeks. Since, for starters, lots of ballots will still be coming in after Election Day. In a lot of states, mail-in ballots don't have to be received by Election Day. They just have to be postmarked by then, meaning that the post office has received and processed them. And in some states, officials aren't allowed to start counting mailed ballots until Election Day. It takes time for election workers to open envelopes, flatten out ballots, and verify voter signatures. But remember, mail-in ballots count just as much as those cast in person. So we need to let the process work and make sure every vote gets counted. A few states have been doing elections completely by mail for a while, and people there are used to waiting for results. Patience is just part of the deal. In other words, an early lead on election night doesn't guarantee a win. So if any candidate is claiming early victory, be skeptical. That goes for news sources too. Remember that some commentators may want a particular candidate to win, and media outlets more aligned with one party could be quick to draw conclusions about who won. If that gets shared around enough, it could create a false narrative and damage the public trust in the election.
If you're looking for a really reliable projection, go to the Associated Press. They're an independent cooperative made up of thousands of reporters. Bottom line is, even though this year's election is kind of different, even if the results take a while to come in, when all is said and done, the results will be just as rock solid as any other year.
And newsflash, this stuff really matters. The president and other elected officials make decisions that have a big impact on your life, from education to immigration to policing. So please remind the adults in your life to vote.
Pretty please.
Oh yeah, we gotta run. Moby and I are driving people to the polls. Thanks for joining.
Hello? Am I still on? This isn't very professional.
It's Saturday. Are you ready to make this happen? Your campaign to be President of the United States? Remember? Like we talked about at the pool 3 days ago. I was going to be your campaign manager? Dear Rita and Moby, how does our country pick its president? From Sasha O. Well, Sasha, as I was saying, United States presidential elections happen every 4 years. And to be honest, we're a little late to the game. It's September, so America's two major political parties have a huge head start. They've already picked nominees, their official choices to run for president. The Democrats are the more liberal or left-leaning party. They believe government has an obligation to take care of its citizens. Money from taxes should be used to pay for basic services and financial security. Things like health care, public education, and retirement funds.
The Republicans take a more conservative or right-leaning stance. They believe in lowering taxes and shrinking government programs. People will have more money to spend, helping businesses grow and create jobs.
Actually, boss, we've got a lot of catching up to do. Come on, let's walk and talk. Voters are already familiar with the Republican and Democratic nominees. They won their party's support in state-by-state elections, primaries, and caucuses. Traveling the country for months, they debated how to refine their party's core beliefs. They each shared their specific views on vital issues. The candidate
This is an outrage. I demand a phone call. A British spy? But I'm an American citizen. Dear Agent Moby, what does it mean to be a citizen? From Dan. You want me to prove my citizenship by answering this letter? Alright, mister, I'll play your game. This is an outrage. I demand a phone call. A British spy? But I'm an American citizen. Dear Agent Moby, what does it mean to be a citizen? From Dan. You want me to prove my citizenship by answering this letter?
Alright, mister, I'll play your game. A citizen is a legal member of a community like a city, state, or country. Citizenship guarantees you certain rights, but it comes with some responsibilities too. Every country has citizens and its own definition of citizenship. But since I'm trying to prove my allegiance to my native land, let's focus on what it means to be a citizen of the United States. Every U.S. citizen is a free and equal member of American society and gets to enjoy all the rights guaranteed by the Constitution. That's the document that lays out the plan for our government. It's the supreme law of the land. The basic rights of American citizens are listed in the Constitution's first 10 amendments, also known as the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights guarantees all citizens freedom of speech and religion, the right to privacy and trial by jury, and a whole bunch of other important protections. Later amendments to the Constitution added new rights and protections. After the Civil War, the 14th Amendment expanded the definition of citizenship to include anyone born in the United States. It also guarantees all citizens equal protection, so a state can't pass a law that denies you your constitutional rights. Right, that goes for people too. You have to respect the rights of other citizens. It's not just being nice, it's mandatory, which means you have to do it. There are other mandatory responsibilities too, like paying taxes, serving on juries, and basically obeying the law. If you don't follow up on these responsibilities, you could face a punishment, like having to pay a fine or even serving time in jail. Then there are responsibilities that aren't mandatory, but highly encouraged. For one thing, citizens in democratic societies are expected to actively participate in government. The best way to do that is by exercising one of our most important rights, the right to vote. In a democracy, the government's power comes from the people. By keeping informed about important issues, choosing the elected officials to represent them, and even running for office themselves, citizens really control how their government works. What do you mean? Of course you were born here. Weren't you? Right. Well, even if you weren't, you can still become a citizen later in life. The U.S. is known as a melting pot, a mixture of people from many different ethnic backgrounds. Most American citizens either moved here from other countries or descended from people who did. These immigrants have come from all over the world, leaving their home countries to start new lives. To become an American citizen, immigrants have to go through a process called naturalization. To be naturalized, you need to live in the U.S., and you should definitely know how to read and speak English. After you fill out an application form, you get interviewed by an immigration officer, and then you take a citizenship test. Relax, the interview is just to make sure that you're eligible for citizenship, that you're not a dangerous person, and that you respect the Constitution. And the test makes sure you have a basic knowledge of U.S. laws, history, and symbols like the American flag. Once you pass the test, you attend a ceremony where you take an oath of allegiance, and presto, you're officially a naturalized citizen. No, it's not exactly a walk in the park, but it's not supposed to be. Citizenship is a privilege that reflects our democratic values and brings people from many backgrounds together under one national identity. So, have I convinced you that I'm a citizen yet? Good. Now for my phone call. Hello, Burger Shack? I'd like to order a strawberry milkshake. Shaken, not stirred. I can't believe my theme for the dance wasn't chosen. Yeah, I know. Vote's a vote. Dear Tim and Moby, what's democracy? From Helen. Democracy is a Greek word that means rule by the people. Basically, that means that every single person has a say in what happens, that everyone can participate in the government, and that the purpose of the government is to protect the rights of the people. Yeah, it sounds kind of obvious to us, but it hasn't always been like that. And it isn't like that everywhere in the world today. The Greek city-state of Athens had one of the earliest democracies. Instead of following the orders of a king or emperor, the citizens of Athens voted on how to run their city. Government officials were chosen randomly by a lottery system because Athenians thought that every citizen could and should hold office. Juries were chosen randomly too, and they were a lot bigger than ours are today. Well, no. When the Greeks said everyone, they meant something a little different from what we mean. First of all, you had to be a citizen from birth, which meant that both your mother and father had to be Athenian. Second, you couldn't be a slave. Also, you had to be male and an adult, and you had to own your own land or your own home. So, the voting population ended up being pretty small and not very representative of the Athenian population. Well, even with these problems, democracy worked pretty well for Athens. A lot of other city-states around the Mediterranean adopted it. Ancient Rome, which owed much of its culture to Greece, started off as a democracy. But unlike Athens, it wasn't a direct democracy where citizens debate and vote on every issue. Instead, Rome was a representative democracy, or republic, where citizens elected senators to represent their interests in debates and votes. Well, it's a nice idea to have every citizen take an active part in government, but not everyone has time to debate and vote on every issue. Athens' direct democracy only works well for small populations. For larger states, it makes more sense to have people represent you in the government. It worked for Rome. Their representative democracy lasted several hundred years before it was replaced by an empire ruled by a single emperor. When that happened, democracy kind of died off for a while. But in the centuries afterward, it kept popping up in various forms. That's true. Like Rome, the United States is a republic. We elect leaders to represent us in Congress instead of voting on every issue ourselves. And unlike Athens or Rome, pretty much every adult citizen of the United States can vote. Well, there are some voting restrictions, like if you've committed a serious crime. No system of government is perfect, but democracy in some form or another is working pretty well for over half the world's countries. Hey, you know what? This outfit gives me an idea for another dance theme. Toga, 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 toga. Hey, I was reading that. A shrink ray, huh? Maybe that'll come in handy for this. Dear Tim and Moby, how do you reduce fractions? From Zeb. Let's see if Moby can answer that. What do you mean it didn't work? You just reduced a fraction. Reducing a fraction means simplifying it so that the numerator and denominator are both as small as they can possibly be.
No, the value of the fraction stays the same when you reduce it. That's why most mathematicians prefer to use the word simplify. The point is to make the fraction as simple as possible. Remember when we ordered that pizza last week? We got the usual, half pepperoni and half ball bearings and screws. The pizza had 6 slices. But when we called to order, we didn't ask for 3/6 pepperoni and 3/6 metal. We asked for half and half. That's because 3/6 is the same as 1/2. In mathematical terms, they're equivalent fractions. What do you mean I should stop using pizza to illustrate math concepts? I like pizza. Anyway, to simplify a fraction, you first have to find the greatest common factor of the numerator and the denominator. That's the largest number that will divide evenly into both. Let's say you're given the following fraction, 12/20. To find the greatest common factor, you can make a list of all the factors of 12 and 20 and then pick the biggest one they have in common. Hey, can you set that thing on factor? So, the factors of 12 are 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 12. And the factors of 20 are 1, 2, 4, 5, 10, and 20. Looks like the greatest common factor is 4. To simplify that fraction, you just divide both the numerator and denominator by their greatest common factor. 12 divided by 4 is 3, so our numerator is 3. And 20 divided by 4 is 5, so our denominator is 5. So 12/20, written in the simplest possible terms, is 3/5. Let's try it again with 4/14. Let's see. The factors of 4 are 1, 2, and 4, and the factors of 14 are 1, 2, 7, and 14. Looks like the greatest common factor is 2. So the next step is, right, dividing the numerator and the denominator by 2. 4 divided by 2 is 2, and 14 divided by 2 is 7. So 4/14 simplifies to 2/7. Well, if there are no common factors, the fraction can't be rewritten. It's already in its simplest form. Now, can I have my book back? What do you mean there's no enlarging ray? How am I supposed to find out if Adrian and Paul live happily ever after?
Gee, thanks a lot, crazy robot.
Whoa, buddy. You don't want to do that. I don't care if you want to buy a signed copy of Twilight. He's charging 50% interest. And if you don't pay him back... If you want the DVD so bad, you can save up for it. Dear Tim and Moby, can you tell me about debt? From Newton. Hey there, Newton. In the simplest terms, debt is money that's owed to somebody else. Moby was about to borrow $100. He was going to be in debt to that shark there. Another way of putting it is that the shark was offering Moby $100 in credit. Yup, a credit card is just an ongoing offer of credit. That's the most common way to run up personal debt. When you use a card, the credit card company pays for your purchase. In effect, you've borrowed money from the company, and you have to repay them later. Like most other lenders, credit cards charge interest, a fee for borrowing money. It's calculated as a percentage of the amount you borrowed. and it's usually charged every month. Dear Tim and Moby, can you tell me about debt? From Newton. Hey there, Newton. In the simplest terms, debt is money that's owed to somebody else. Moby was about to borrow $100. He was going to be in debt to that shark there. Another way of putting it is that the shark was offering Moby $100 in credit. Yup, a credit card is just an ongoing offer of credit. That's the most common way to run up personal debt. When you use a card, the credit card company pays for your purchase. In effect, you've borrowed money from the company, and you have to repay them later. Like most other lenders, credit cards charge interest, a fee for borrowing money. It's calculated as a percentage of the amount you borrowed. And it's usually charged every month. So, the faster you repay your debt, the less interest you pay. Right, any fair lender would charge you way less than that shark. But even so, going into debt always carries some risk. If you're ever late on a payment, you can be charged penalty fees. Plus, it's recorded on your credit history, a public record of your reliability as a borrower. Anytime you apply for a credit card or a loan, the bank will look at your credit history. After all, your debt is a risk for the lender, too. If you default or stop making payments on your loan, they'll lose money. They can take you to a special court where you might be ordered to give up part of your paycheck or even sell some of your property. No, I'm not saying you shouldn't ever go into debt. In fact, it's often necessary. Most people don't have enough money lying around for something like a house or a car. Or let's say you want to become a doctor. Medical school is expensive, so you take out a student loan. Since doctors usually make a good living, you'll probably be able to pay the loan back over time. So in this case, the debt is an investment in your future. Oh, and speaking of college, that's when a lot of people receive their first credit card offers. You have to be really careful with these. They'll offer attractive rates at first because the card companies want new customers. For a lot of young people, the temptation is too much. They run up a ton of debt without thinking about how they're going to repay it. By the time they're out of college, they have a student loan debt plus a mountain of credit card bills. They can spend years and years climbing back out of debt just when they're getting started in life. Getting out of debt takes time and discipline. You have to skimp on things you might enjoy, like movies and vacations. To avoid racking up more debt, you need to make do with what you can afford at the moment. It's not impossible, but it's a situation you definitely want to avoid. Your best bet is to avoid any debt if you can. Get into the habit of saving up for the things you want.
Nothing will stop my diabolical plan to sink Tasmania. Certainly not some woodland rodent.
You may be an evil genius, Dr. Platypus, but let's get one thing straight. Rabbits are not rodents!
Hey, Moby, I think I see a mountain cottontail. This isn't what I meant when I invited you to come rabbit watching with me. Dear Tim and Moby, taking care of my pet bunny, Pebbles, is a lot of work. How do all the rabbits in the forest take care of themselves? From Kira. Aw, look, it's a picture of Pebbles. I don't have a pet rabbit, but I know they need at least a few basic things. A home, food, water, and waste cleanup. Wild rabbits need all that too, but they get it from their ecosystem. A group of living things interacting with each other and their environment. It can include thousands of different species or types of organisms. Here, it's brush rabbits, redwoods, and gray foxes, plus countless species of birds, plants, insects, and microbes. Every individual is part of a population, all the members of the same species that live there. And all of the populations in an ecosystem form its community. Their differences give this ecosystem the power to support so much life. One creature's trash is another's treasure. A problem for one species is an opportunity for another. In ecosystems, living things form a network that provides for each of their needs. You're right, the environment's really important too. You'll never find rabbits living underwater. Like all organisms, they need the right habitat or place to live. Somewhere with air to breathe and land to hop around. Their habitat also has to include other living things, like grasses to munch and bushes to hide in. Those organisms help rabbits survive. Other creatures in the community make it harder. Yeah, that word, community, can make it sound like everyone's looking out for each other. They're not. Up close, individuals are often fighting one another for survival. But this struggle helps keep the ecosystem as a whole stable. If every individual survived and reproduced, populations would keep growing endlessly. Which doesn't happen because resources like space and water are limited. Ecosystems force species to make the most of what's available. Their success depends on how effectively they can use the living and non-living things in their habitat. This activity defines the species' role or niche in an ecosystem. Well, niches fall into three big categories, and they all have to do with food. First up, producers. They make their own food, usually with energy from sunlight. Producers are the power plant of every ecosystem, whether on land or at sea. They bring in energy, and organisms throughout the ecosystem use it up. On land, most producers are plants. They use most of the energy they get from sunlight to live, grow, and reproduce. And they store the rest of it in their bodies. When a bunny eats a plant, it gets some of that leftover energy. Since rabbits have to eat or consume other organisms to survive, they're called consumers. If a fox eats a bunny, then it gets some of the energy the bunny got from plants. So, all the energy in ecosystems ultimately comes from the sun. Nah, bunnies and foxes do a lot more than just consume. When rabbits eat plants, they can help spread that plant's seeds. When foxes eat other animals, they leave some scraps behind. Those scraps become food for scavengers, like certain insects. And whatever's left goes to my personal favorites, the decomposers. This group includes fungi, like mushrooms, and many microbes, like bacteria. For them, food is dead stuff and poop. Decomposers break all that down and return the nutrients to the environment. If it weren't for them, nasty stuff would just pile up, like if you'd never cleaned your rabbit's litter box. Decomposers recycle the matter back into the soil, water, and air. Yeah, it's weird to think about. Living and non-living things are made of the same ingredients, just rearranged. These ingredients move around different parts of the planet in cycles. Like, you've probably heard of the water cycle. It's how water moves between the sky, earth, and living things. Trillions of gallons of water are stored in the world's organisms. Another key ingredient for living things is a material called carbon. It moves through the living and non-living parts of Earth, too, through the